just to kind of give you an overview of what that was. So, for the last 60 years, NASA's done a lot to push our exploration since we went to the moon the first time. And Frank will probably hit on it. We've really pushed forward, and we see an economy starting to grow in low Earth orbit. Our next big leap is for us to jump beyond. So we have the Artemis program. So in mythology, Artemis is the twin sister of Apollo. And our program is to go push and land the first woman and the next man on the surface of the moon. And we're not just going back to the moon, we're going forward to the moon. So the plan is for us to push our economy out there, find a way to harness the resources in deep space, learn how to live and build on the surface of the moon so that we can actually take that next leap to Mars. Critical in all this, we have to leverage the commercial industry around to make sure what we're doing is driving forward. Everything NASA does usually falls right back to what we do here on Earth. The power of the computers to get to the moon in the 60s is dwarfed by what's in the palm of your hand today. And the amount of data on orbit and what that does for our economy is just tremendous and continues to grow by leaps and bounds. So at NASA, we're the research and development leg for the federal government. We're constantly pushing the envelope, trying to help enable exploration to help better what we know about our planet and how we do things on our planet. So we're here today to kind of just help you understand the piece that we have in Artemis. What you saw in that animation was the Gateway, which is a small space station. It's an orbiting platform around the moon in a highly elliptical orbit. So if you think of a railway, right, something that we can launch from Earth and hook onto that, and then it gives us that command module ability to go down to the surface at multiple places on the moon so we can really harness what's there. You think about, here we are in Central Florida, right? So if you're going to go back somewhere, someone's going to come and the tourism industry comes to Central Florida, they don't get off the airport and go straight to that attraction that they've been planning for. They go establish a home base somewhere, one of the resorts somewhere. That home base then establishes their port to go back and forth and explore all that Central Florida has to offer. That's what we're doing with Gateway. We're putting this command post in lunar orbit so we can send up our human landers, send up our crew on Orion, go down to the moon, all over the surface of the moon, really understand what it has to offer, and really help us figure out how to push a commercial supply chain beyond the node of just this planet Earth. Once we've done that and we've established an economy that's growing beyond low Earth orbit, we can keep exploring further and further. So I'm excited to represent Artemis, represent where we're going. The Kennedy Space Center has a huge piece in this. I'm the manager of the logistics element, which is a piece of Gateway. That's where we are going to set up the commercial supply chain to deep space, and we'll kind of go back and forth and get into that. So I'll let Frank introduce himself.
Thank you, Mark. And I have to tell you that following a NASA video, and Mark Wiese is a hard act to follow, fortunately, we're dealing with a subject that's of interest to everybody, especially Floridians, because the space industry has always been dear to our hearts. And you've heard me say a number of times that today, now, is Florida's time to grow its space industry. We have done a super job in a sense of building on the work of several past legislators, legislation that has been favorable to space, the kind of business environment that has been created by multiple past governors and those in Tallahassee to create a permitting and regulatory environment, a tax environment that is very supportive of the growth of the space industry. We have come from an era where we used to launch just a few, 8 to 12 launches a year, to one where we are dramatically increasing our launch cadence, and we're no longer just launching things, we're manufacturing spacecraft and rockets and satellites here in Florida. So it's an exciting time. But we're also making investments in our spaceport capabilities, and the freight and logistics system that supports it. And I want to come back to that point later on as we discuss it, because it's not enough to just look at the spaceport or the port complex. It's all of the freight and logistics systems that allow the flow of materials, payloads, the rockets, the fuels, everything to flow back and forth if we are ever to become a global space trade port or an interstellar trade port. And that is the vision that we've got. We're preparing the spaceport to be able to handle up to 100 launches a year. And we want not only to have those 100 launches spread out over time, but we want to be able to do simultaneous launches. We want to be able to do launch on demand. We want to do satellite on demand, and we're building those capabilities into our Florida array of capabilities. In the next decade, we expect over 10,000 satellites to be launched to support our insatiable demand for bandwidth globally and to connect all of the people in the world that are now unconnected to the internet. But more importantly, there'll be companies that are going up into low Earth orbit to do things, to create research and manufacturing value in space. And our vision is for Florida to be the ground node of that emerging on-orbit or low Earth orbit economy. Secretary Ross, Secretary of the Department of Transportation, has shown a $1 trillion cislunar economy that is out there. We want Florida to have the lion's share of that business. So what does all of that have to do with going back to the moon? Well, what we are building in Florida is an array of commercial space capabilities that will form the logistic support. We're very excited by the mission that NASA has to go back to the moon, and this time to stay there. And NASA has wisely laid out a path for getting us back there by mid-decade using partnerships with industry. And so as we build a commercial capability of industry to support that, the future is ours to become a major part of that cislunar economy. And cislunar refers to anything from the edge of Earth to the moon. It's all of that area in between, including the surface of the moon. So it is exciting. We want to be NASA's partner in going back to the moon, and I can tell you that the commercial industry that we're building as a state and that this chamber is so focused on will not only be a major part of Florida's economic well-being, but it'll be a major part of that cislunar economy. With that, I guess we can talk back and forth, Mark, about some of the implications of what NASA's planning.
So you mentioned logistics. So, for a long time, I think the Kennedy Space Center was looked at as, well, this is where it all comes together, where we do the final testing. We move the big pieces. We have the iconic, vehicle assembly building and these huge crawlers. And that was the inspiration behind Kennedy and, the final place where we would launch it from. And this piece that we've evolved into, in 2011 when we flew the last space shuttle, it was a tough day at the Kennedy Space Center, and to see all those jobs, slow down. Very thankful for the things that Space Florida does to help champion and find a way to pull other industries into Florida to take advantage of those talents that existed in our workforce, make sure we didn't lose that to other states. And at the Kennedy Space Center, we are now leading the agency in being reborn from that, change that we went through. So we are the commercial, center of expertise for how to partner with industry here at the Kennedy Space Center. And this logistics element piece that we have of the Artemis program is the largest piece to date. So there's big aspects of moving the crew, big aspects of getting landers down to the surface. We have a contract that we're evaluating right now, which is the first long-term contract. It represents a 15-year period of performance with a $7 billion cap to supply our Artemis missions over the next decade and a half. That represents pushing logistics, pushing a supply chain, but bringing as much of it to this spaceport and to the ground infrastructure so that we can set up and push that economy beyond.
That space policy directive that I referred to that ties to the role of commercial industry in space, essentially NASA's mission comes from Space Policy Directive 1, which was issued by the National Space Council, and gave NASA the mission to go back to the moon and then beyond, but to pursue its exploration mission. Space Policy Directive 2 is equally exciting in that it really turns over all of that activity in low Earth orbit to commercial companies and asks them also to accompany NASA by providing the logistic support. If you think about that, as we become an interstellar trade port, which is the vision that we have for the state and for our spaceport system, we want to be able to handle the flow of goods and materials that may be coming from Japan or from China or other parts of the world here, going up into space where value is created, and we want to be able to support that value creation both here, going up, as well as coming down. So logistic support is a big, big part of what we're planning for the future in the state.
I looked at the Florida 2030 vision, and I think it's so critical to see in there the push to make sure we continue to grow the exponential talent that is in Central Florida to help drive innovation. What we're doing here, today we've got a space station in low Earth orbit. That's a Central Florida, Miami type distance. Where we're going to the moon is 250,000 miles away, right? So It's a much further push to get out that distance. It's going to require a lot more innovation. We got to do things a lot more autonomously, a lot more robotics, artificial intelligence. So to have that technology growth in Central Florida helps attract companies to want to simplify their supply chain, bring business here, which then grows beyond just the spaceport and helps push that, even further into what Florida can bring.
I do have to comment that when I've looked at categorizing the space industry capability in the state, it truly is present in every county in the state. There's a supply chain of companies that goes down into every area, and there is a significant increase in the amount of manufacturing that we're doing. Over the last couple of years, the state has added over 30,000 manufacturing jobs to our profile. And we're going to continue to supply a lot of the goods and materials to support that logistics chain. But what also really excites us, there are a number of companies that we're talking to that are going to go beyond just logistics support of going up to Gateway. They want to go to the surface of the moon. They want to populate the surface of the moon with habitats, with rovers, and with mini cities that are doing not only economic value development in terms of product, but perhaps even refinement of fuels and development of things that are necessary for space flight and brought to the Gateway from the surface of the moon. And that is also pretty exciting for us.
Yeah, ultimately, one of the biggest costs is launching something and escaping Earth's gravity. So if we can find a way to harness the resources that are out at the moon, we made an announcement on Friday about a rover that'll go and really map the surface of the moon, drill down a meter deep to try to access the water that's there so we can separate the elements into hydrogen and oxygen. We have some rocket fuel there. If we can understand a better understanding of the regolith, the lunar dust, now we've got feedstock for 3D printers that we could send up and try to build things on the surface of the moon, which helps mean that when we go to Mars, maybe we can start to pull some of those supplies from the moon. What that means for the economy back here is as we start to understand and harness what is out there, we can figure out what we can send back to Earth, what we can do off planet to help our economy, help our climate here on planet.
A question that I have, Mark, NASA has laid out a program that's consistent with the funding that Congress has provided, which gets us back to the moon in mid-decade and provides for continuing to build the logistics chain to support space operations beyond that for a few years. How long will Artemis, as currently funded, be able to extend out? And then what's beyond it? What can we talk to commercial companies about? What's after Artemis?
So Artemis expands pretty far right now. So Gateway has been in the budget before the latest push. We were planning to assemble the Gateway and have that first mission go there in the mid-2020s. This March, the Vice President challenged us to accelerate that to 2024. Congress right now is working through the appropriation process to help bring the funding that'll accelerate that to 2024. The plans for how we lay this all out, we're moving faster than we've ever moved before. So, I've worked a lot of acquisitions during my career. Typically, it's an 18-month to 24-month cycle, and the one I'm on right now is gonna come in probably less than 12, and that includes, a month where we had an unfortunate government shutdown and really were hands off. That push gets us out into the mid-2030s to be ready to go to Mars. So this Artemis campaign really expands beyond the 2030s. It's to set us up to go to Mars by the end of this decade and then to start exploring Mars, and then hopefully it's enabling us to have that ability to just extend beyond and keep going further and further into the solar system.
One of my long-standing complaints, especially with respect to large space systems and space exploration initiatives, is that they are very difficult. We're pushing the edges of technology, and they take a long time. And especially the procurement process within government takes a long time. From the point of view, from the earliest statement of requirements to the point when you field the system can be 10 to 15, even 20 years. What is so exciting, and I'm throwing this out not as a slap at NASA, but as a compliment to NASA, that through the partnership program that the Kennedy Space Center in particular has been so successful in implementing, they've partnered with industry to achieve a number of major objectives in record time. We have two companies that are building next generation spacecraft so that we can return crew to the International Space Station. And that has, the development by both SpaceX and Boeing has occurred in record time, and that will be something that we'll see come into play next year. Am I correct, Mark?
Correct.
So partnerships have been a key part of not only the past, but your future.
It's really, cultural change is slow. Usually takes that significant emotional event, right? So the shuttle program was the significant emotional event, and I'm very proud of what we're able to do at the Kennedy Space Center, because we've looked all across, the process and systems we put in place. There's a lot of pride that we are the ones that understand how to process a human spaceflight vehicle, how to make sure our crews are safe. And you document that pride over time. As your company grows, you end up institutionalizing what you do. And we've had to take a step back from that and figure out, we need to tell commercial industry what we need, not how, and then focus our NASA role on having, the right insight and the right perspective along the way to measure the how, so that we can buy down the risk and find a way that works for commercial industry. We don't want to be the sole customer out there, because that doesn't have a sustainable business case. We need industry to have a sustainable business case, and we are seeing that with what you guys have done. A lot of the commercial launches that, put the power of data in your hand weren't all coming from Florida, and that switch has changed. I mean, we've really turned that corner, and we see a lot of commercial launches now coming out of the Space Coast, which is really opening up the economy, opening up our ability to move forward.
You do have to be careful when you ask industry, what is it that you need, Mark? Because there are some companies out there who will tell you. Two companies in particular have made a dramatic impact on the profile of how we're doing space. And in fact, commercial companies are changing the way we do space. But I'll refer to, even though we've had long-standing great suppliers in Boeing and Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman and a whole variety of others, today you've got SpaceX and Blue Origin and Sierra Nevada who are changing the landscape. And they have ambitions way beyond just going to the moon. SpaceX is building a spacecraft right now in Florida and a competing site in Texas, which is their Starship program, which eventually is aimed at flying up to 100 people to space, to the moon and beyond. Eventually that will transform into a spacecraft to Mars. Blue Origin has similar plans. The rocket that they're building in Florida is some 340 feet tall, and it's a big rocket. And it's capable of doing a lot of the things that we're also planning on having our space launch system provide. So there'll be other companies that have ambitions to go to the moon, to go beyond, and to, in one sense, take manufacturing and other things off the surface of the Earth to help us preserve the planet. And I know NASA's paying a lot of attention to that.
And the scope goes not just to the big ones, it's all the way down to the smaller companies too. So I know, we made a push back 5 years or so with the venture class, the really small rockets, and what they could help supply and bring at a lower cost point to open it up to more industry. You guys made a really hard play at trying to pull Rocket Lab in here. That went to Virginia, but you grabbed Firefly, so you've got another company coming in. That will all lead into this as well. So it's not just the big cargo resupply, it's the smaller ones. And what that does also is it translates to us every day in where we're going to go with high-speed point-to-point transport. Right now, you want to FedEx something across the country, how you can do that, and when it's going to be there and when you got to get it in the mail by. But as this cost point and ability to move things at a higher velocity lowers, you'll start to see this globe continually to shrink as we can move goods and services even faster across oceans.
This morning, Secretary Thibault mentioned a lot of the capabilities that we're developing in Florida with autonomous vehicles. And robotic devices and autonomous vehicles have always been a big part of the space program. But we are also looking at human spaceflight as a key component of going forward. There have been a lot of studies done that we have a difficult time with the radiation environment of space. And I know we've attracted one company that is looking at technologies other than shielding, because our historic approach has always been to shield the spacecraft to keep our astronauts alive. Can you comment on some of the things that NASA's looking at that go beyond shielding? Is shielding adequate? Can we keep humans alive?
Yeah, so we are definitely looking at shielding. Obviously, the radiation environment out there on the moon is much harsher. So we're partnering with universities to study those technologies. That is one of the biggest ones, to make sure our electronics can survive, the humans can survive. And we've got a whole series of precursor missions that'll go out ahead of the 2024 launch for us to be able to test that technology. We also know that we have designed a lot of that into our traditional human spaceflight program. So you mentioned the Orion capsule, Lockheed Martin, with a lot of help from Space Florida to set up that manufacturing facility at the Kennedy Space Center. They are working to establish that deep space transportation capability for our crew. So we're going to be able to leverage the things that are coming out of that. Another big push for us is robotics. So we have to go up there autonomously, come together with Gateway, autonomously dock, autonomously undock, potentially have internal robotic systems that, love to be able to see some of that play forward into my house someday so that it can clean itself a little bit easier.
Well, there's also talk, we have been able to attract one company that is looking at stem cell technology as a way of protecting humans from radiation. And that means a transformational human for long-duration spaceflight. I have asked them if they can work on making me taller and getting me ready for a spaceflight, but that's a long way off, I suspect. Is stem cell technology one of those things that makes some sense for the future?
So stem cell technology definitely makes sense. There's so much in the pharmaceutical industry that will take advantage of what our national laboratory in low Earth orbit has to offer. So the space station's been up there for about 20 years. That becomes a great test bed for us to push how we can increase our healthcare options here on Earth that help not just us, but also help astronauts as we push them further beyond. So that's another great avenue for us to continually advance the technology and find ways to play it forward.
NASA's focused on building the Gateway, and you also have focused in the past decade or so on building SLS, which is the Space Launch System, and the Orion spacecraft, which is also being assembled and manufactured here in Florida. They'll be the primary workhorse vehicles for going to the moon and beyond. But there are others. This week there was an announcement by Blue Origin, teamed with Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman and Draper, to provide some complementary hardware to get us down to the surface of the Earth and back. That's part of NASA's plan as well?
Yeah. So the Artemis Campaign is really wide and broad. So it's the science and technology pushes that the agency is doing. It's our science missions that we send that are robotic and not crewed. And then it's Gateway and the human landing system, which is what you allude to there, and then it's the SLS rocket and the Orion capsule and all the ground support equipment at Kennedy Space Center to make that happen. The big new pieces are Gateway and the human lander. So the Gateway, we have awarded a contract. The first piece, the big power generation piece, that got awarded in May. Maxar Technologies, they're based out of Palo Alto, California. That'll launch in 2022. The next piece we're calling Halo. So it's a habitation and logistics outpost. It's a docking hub where we can aggregate the different pieces. That's been awarded to Northrop Grumman. It's based out of the Johnson Space Center. And then our big piece is this logistics element, a spacecraft that'll go up just before the crew each time, pre-position all the supplies they need, carry the spacesuits, carry anything else we need science-wise, and make sure it's that big trunk, cargo trunk we're bringing up there. Then Orion comes up and docks, but we also have to build out this human landing capability. So that solicitation is on the street right now as well. That one's being run out of Huntsville, out of the Marshall Space Flight Center.
Where's that?
So the human landing system, I agree. And so they're running the contract angle, and we need all the help we can, because obviously we need supply chains to be here. That's what drives costs down. If they can build as much of these pieces here locally, that's what we want. Because if we're going to launch 100 times a year, we don't need to be moving it from California, Texas, or Alabama. We want as much of it to be happening right here.
Well said. I hope everybody got that. Okay, now for the big question. We know it's not Taylor Swift, and we know it's not Ariana Grande. Do you have an idea of who the first woman on the moon is going to be?
I have heard we're very close to making an announcement. I'm very proud to see. Hopefully, if you didn't see this, I'm sorry you missed it, but last week we had a very historical moment where we had the first 2 female spacewalkers doing an extra vehicle activity spacewalk for the first time. Kind of coming off the heels of the last presentation, so much of what we do is help inspire the next generation. So I am of this Artemis generation. I was not alive when we went to the moon last time. I grew up watching the space shuttle program. I was inspired by growing up across from a military base in New York and seeing high-speed jets and wanting to get involved in aerospace. And that is so much of what NASA gets to do, and we're so happy to have Florida helping bring as much of this locally so kids can see this hardware, kids can be inspired by what we do, and they can help, go and get educated beyond their dreams to help us, help our overall economy, help the technology boom that Florida is going to lead.
I have two questions for my grandchildren. Is there life on the moon?
We sent up something that had life that recently crashed, so there may be.
So now there's life on the moon. And the last question is Darth Vader on the moon?
So, I can't tell you that one in front of everybody else.
Okay. We are out of time. I wish that we had more. It's an interesting subject, but thank you all.